Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of Space Warfighter Talks. I'm your host, Bill Wolf, the president and founder of the Space Force Association. We are honored to have with us today Lt Gen Saltzman, the U.S. Space Force Chief Operating Officer. Thank you so much, General Saltzman, for being here.
Absolutely. Happy to be here.
And before we get started, sir, what I'd like to do is just say a quick thanks to all of our individual members of the Space Force Association and, of course, our corporate members of the Space Force Association. They are Lockheed Martin, Braxton Technologies, Numerica, Boresight, and AGI. Thanks so much for realizing and helping us to realize the vision of the Space Force Association. Sir, we're going to talk about a lot of stories today. We've known each other for a long time. I remember the first time we were introduced, we actually went on missile crew duty together. You were a chief of stand eval, and I was a brand new second lieutenant in the missile wing. So you're Captain Saltzman, I'm Lieutenant Wolf. And as a chief of stand eval, the best thing you can do is just stay out of your, reign of influence. So I needed to stay away, stay as safe as I could on alert while we were conducting that alert. And I remember we were driving out to alert and you said, hey, I'm kind of tired. I'm going to go ahead and hit the rack, which is standard for crew duty. And you hit the rack in the afternoon. And I thought the safest thing for me to do is just let you sleep as long as possible so I could stay out of trouble. What's the next thing you remember, sir, from that?
I think I woke up in the truck on the way home. I don't even know how you got me upstairs and into the truck. Yeah, it was one of the best alerts I ever had.
Yes, sir. I remember it was 4 o'clock in the morning and you ripped the curtain open and said, what is going on? So, sir, it's been great to watch your career throughout the years. And thank you so much for being here. I'm very familiar with your career, but sir, for the folks on the audience, would you mind just telling them a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'd be happy to. And I'll try to maybe skip the boring stuff, or at least some of the boring stuff that you can find in the bio. But I was born and raised in Kentucky. That makes me a diehard University of Kentucky basketball fan. But I went to Boston University, which makes me a diehard Boston Red Sox fan. I was commissioned through ROTC, Air Force ROTC. Little known fact is one of my classmates, Lieutenant General Bill LaCourie, who's our Space Force S58 right now. We were in a class of 6. I'm pretty sure he was number 1, and I think I was like number 7 of 6. But Bill and I go way back. So that was Boston University. My first assignment, ICBMs, as you just mentioned, up in Montana. And then I learned to fly satellites with the National Reconnaissance Office. I was one of the lucky ones that got to go out to Sunnyvale, California, and work out of the Blue Cube, that was called back in the day. It's now not a ground station anymore, but that was a great place to learn how to fly satellites. I was fortunate enough to go to weapons school. I think our paths crossed there briefly as well, but and got to stick around as an instructor for a couple of years before going off to school.
So sir, real quick on that, who was a student that challenged your instructor abilities probably the most?
Well, clearly you know the answer to that. I tell a bunch of stories about being an instructor, and it just turns out I'm just telling stories about trying to teach you anything. It seems like over and over and over again, those are all my best stories. Getting some piece of information into your thick skull. Yeah, after school, I went to be a squadron commander out at Vandenberg. So I was lucky enough to command the 614th Space Operations Squadron and the 1st Space Control Squadron at the time. Those were the squadrons that made up the Combat Operations Division of the then JSPOC, now CSPOC, out at Vandenberg. It was a great time. We were standing it up, basically, and carving out new processes and procedures, and really learned a lot from being out in the JSPOC. Got to go back to Boston for a little bit and knock out War College at Harvard. That was a lot of fun. And then got to command the 460th Operations Group, the DSP and Simbers constellation. Now it's a part of Delta IV, which includes all of our missile warning capabilities. So that's been quite a growth enterprise, and consolidating those into those mission-focused deltas, which we can talk about later if you want. But I was lucky enough to command 460th Ops Group and then stay around Buckley and command the Aerospace Data Facility, Colorado. My second tour back into the NRO. What a great mission, great assignment, great people, and that was fantastic experience. let's see, worked my way back to the Pentagon. I was the Air Force's Director of Current Operations. And while I was doing that, I was lucky enough to be the guy that kind of set the stage for JADC2. At the time, it was multi-domain command and control. And we laid some of the foundational principles, laid some of the initial groundwork that I see still playing out in JADC2. So kind of a proud dad, if you will, for multi-domain command and control. And then most recently, before I came here for this assignment, most recently I was the Deputy Commander of Air Force's Central Command and the DCFAC out at Al Udeid in Qatar.
Thank you, sir. Really appreciate that background. And I know our audience does as well. It's not a standard career progression for a space operator to find themselves as a deputy CFAC out in the air component out in CENTCOM. So what was probably some of the best lessons learned for you as a space operator to take from that experience?
Great question. It was a little daunting, as you get closer and closer to deployment time, first you're excited and then it starts to set in on you. It's like, I'm responsible for what? The air war? Okay, I can do that. So it was great. My whole career led up to that assignment, like any assignment. But, when people said, what did you do to prep for that assignment? And I said, well, I took 26 years and I had a lot of experiences and I watched a lot of leaders and I collected good lessons and cast off some bad lessons and some of the key things that I learned that were effective for me that I'm now trying to make sure I continue to apply over in the Space Force. First and foremost, it is a team sport. Teamwork is absolutely critical. At the level I'm at, there is absolutely no way I could get done my day-to-day chores, if you will, without a solid team around me. And being out there in the desert as a DCFAC was exactly that same experience. I had to build a team that I could count on, that I could trust, that I could delegate to. That meant you have to get to know them. What are their strengths? What are their weaknesses? Know what's making them tick, so you can tell when they're having a bad day and they don't get the hardest problem that day. And so building a teamwork, I just think is really at the top of the list. The skill I used the most was listening. If you're talking more than you're listening, and I know I'm saying that while I'm talking a lot, but if you're not listening more than you're talking, you're making a mistake as a senior leader, I think. There's no question that the colonels and the lieutenant colonels and the tech sergeants that were out there knew more about air power. They certainly knew more about their individual positions than I did. And so it was just important for me to listen. Make sure I understood what the issues were, the nuances, the limitations, what we could do, the opportunities we could take advantage of. And if you just listen, boy, the best ideas just come right up. You can claim them later in your OPR, but right then you just got to listen to them and absorb it. And so I really tried to work hard on that and make sure I was pulling in all the right expertise. Then though, you've got to add value to the process. You can't just sit there and listen. At some point, somebody's got to make a decision. And so I really feel like my time at weapons school, my time in some of my other command jobs helped me really think through how do you do the critical thinking? How do you test assumptions? How do you find where the value needs to be added? Does a decision need to be made now, or can we wait and let this kind of ferment for a while? And so all of those experiences allowed me to maybe add some value by asking the right question, something a little harder than they were willing to ask themselves. And what you provide as a senior leader is you're not down in the fray. You're not down there in the day-to-day technical business that each of those guys were. And so I was able to ask a broader question. Hey, what will the combatant commander think about this? Hey, do we think the Russians are going to respond in a provocative way if we do that? And so I was able to ask a broader question just because I stayed out of the mix and I stayed at a higher level. And I think that definitely paid dividends. And then the last thing is you have to be able to communicate, and that's something I really worked hard at, is making sure that what I was saying, if I was providing guidance, it was going to be as clear as possible so that those experts then could take that action and run with it. And they knew what my intent was. They knew where their bounds were because I'd been as clear in my communication as possible. If you're sloppy with the communication or you don't take the time to really think through it, People can go astray and miss the mark. And now you got to go back and do things again. And we just didn't have time to do that. And so these are all things that I do here on the staff every single day, because we don't have a lot of people. We've got to get it right the first time. And that critical thinking, listening to the experts and testing assumptions. Can we do this better? Or are we going to do it this way we've always done it? Those are all things that are playing out right now.
Thank you, sir. Really do appreciate that. Good lessons. While you were there, you saw some threats being presented to that AOR. Could you talk a little bit about the missile launch that took place earlier this year, and really now transitioning into space, how space supported what it is you needed downrange?
Yeah, it was a surreal night back in January. We knew that some kind of response was coming. We had taken some very violent acts against Iranian terrorists, and we knew that the response was going to happen. Do we know exactly where it's going to happen? No. Do we know exactly when? No. But luckily, we've got some of the best I&W apparatus, indications and warning, anywhere in the world. And what's interesting about that is that the people that were really pulling the data together and telling me exactly when the launch occurred were about 6,000 miles away in Colorado, up there at my old haunts at Buckley. And they were the ones, the initial warnings came over the theater event system from those space operators. And so that, that makes you feel good when you know that, space, your old stomping grounds are right in the middle of the fight that you're out in the desert. Tremendous warning. The team did exactly what you would expect them to do. Timely, accurate, and really it made what could have been a catastrophe really a non-event. And that's not exactly the right way to say that. I mean, it clearly was, not something we want to do again. But when I think about what could have happened, the fact that we had the right communications, the right kind of information to the right people at the right time really did save lives.
Yes, sir. Thank you for that. That brings up another instance where you were basically right in the ops center, if you will, for when adversary countries conducted operations potentially against our capabilities. And what I'm talking about is when you were the 614th Space Operations Squadron Commander, before it was the SPOC and then the JSPOC and CSPOC. During that Chinese ASAT launch, could you explain kind of the situation that was going on the ops center floor and kind of your requirements to provide decision-making information to leadership, and just kind of describe that event?
It was another remarkable time. And, you don't really recognize that you are right in the thick of history when it's unfolding around you. What I wouldn't give to go back and stand there again and kind of soak it in a little better, because it was truly one of those watershed events for the space community writ large. In fact, I've told others, I think we can really chart the origins of the Space Force back to that day. Right. It is not hard to draw the line from that event, which really awakened us to the idea that this is a contested environment. Right. And as a contested environment, you can't do business the way you had been doing it before. And so a series of things start happening and we start having different discussions. And like I said, I think all of that led up to kind of the founding of the Space Force. But if I think back, January 11th, 2007, I'm not keeping track, but it was a pretty big day for me. And this is the old ops center. So you remember, we were the third floor of the headquarters building. Looked more like a command post, quite frankly, than a space operations center. But we were on the phones with the sensors that we thought were most likely to see the event. We were on telephones. We were not going to get any data. There was no real hardcore confirmation. It's about head counts and those sort of things. And the most surreal moment for me was, this is a little embarrassing, I'll have to say, but so I'm standing behind the operator that's on the phone, that's talking to the radar. And I look through the window to my left, and that's where the commander, 14th Air Force commander, and the component commander, if you will, was sitting, and he's on the phone with Stratcom, because obviously this is a big event. I suddenly realized, I think he's looking through the window and I'm supposed to signal him if something's happening, right? And so, you know, I'm kind of using hand signals because we're just talking through a window, and I'm thinking this is not probably the most ideal set of C2 structures. Operators talking on the phone and hand signals through windows. And so that's where we start talking about, you know, data-centric command and control and common operational pictures that allow commanders in real time to see the picture and see the fight and be able to visualize it and make more rapid decisions. And again, I think that event kind of woke us up to that PowerPoint doesn't get you there when you're in a threatened environment and a contested environment with a thinking adversary. And so I learned a lot that day, and some of it was what not to do. But it certainly set the stage for my thinking moving forward.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for that. And we're going to talk a little bit more about how that translates into what today's space warfighter operator needs to conduct their mission. I want to circle back real quickly, though, to the CFAC, because you did bring up your deputy CFAC role, because you did bring up the component and how service capabilities are provided to the combatant commander to conduct their operations. And there's still a lot of discussion about the Space Force versus Space Comm. We can talk about that in just a little bit, but really what I'm curious about is the Director of Space Forces relationship and what that means now that the Space Force has stood up. Could you get into and describe that just a little bit?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, first, the Director of Space Forces has been a critical node for us for years. It's our touch point into the theaters. It's the best way to establish solid, fast reach back to the space centers like the CSPOC at Vandenberg, and to the components at now U.S. Space Command, formerly U.S. Strategic Command. That's that key conduit, if you will, that allowed space to be effectively integrated into the geographic combatant commanders' plans, and we did it through the air component, because we were Air Force, and it makes perfect sense. Now that there's a Space Force, I think what we have to figure out is, does it still make sense? Or do we take those important responsibilities and transition them to a different organizational structure? I don't see the fundamental functions shifting a tremendous amount early on, quite frankly, because the number of capabilities that we're shipping around or how we deploy, a lot of that's going to stay about the same as we were doing it, you know, this time last year. But we got to start setting the stages. And, you know, so whether or not we're going to have a service component or whether or not we're going to come up with some kind of different construct for how better to integrate the capabilities that the Space Force will present to all the combatant commands, that's exactly what we're going through in an analysis of the best way, the most optimal way to present forces.
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for that. And now transitioning back to you as an operator sitting on the floor during that trying time in 2007 at the beginning, not sure what capabilities you had and what you had available to you. Now we have to look at, I think, you know, what other models exist out there? And the one I always come back to is the weapons and tactics model that is used so well in the air domain, which is trying to figure out how to acquire those capabilities, test them out, develop the tactics necessary, bring those tactics to bear in a training environment, a realistic training environment, so that operators can be ready for the contested, degraded, operationally limited environment that they're going to have to face in the future. Can you describe what some of your thoughts are on how to best provide that process to the Space Force and what your role is in that?
I can. You know, the WebTAC model, I agree with you, is a great model, and it's served the Air Force brilliantly for years. At its heart, it's a feedback loop. There are threat-informed requirements that drive the process, and then operators who know the systems inside and out evaluate how well they can perform in that contested environment against a thinking adversary, and they decide how best to go forward. Either they decide they need to make changes to their procedures, tactics, or they decide that there's a material solution that needs to be implemented. And then those requirements that come from a material solution are fed back into the system. I don't see any reason why we shouldn't explore that and take advantage of that fully. We know how that system works. We now have a very threat-informed force, a service now dedicated to looking at a contested environment. And we've got young people out there that know how the systems work. And so leveraging that weapons and tactics model that says the operators that are charged with doing the mission, when they're exposed to a thinking adversary, what are the limitations? What are the gaps? What are the shortfalls? And what are the opportunities? And how do we turn those into new tactics? And how do we turn those into new capabilities, what we learn from them, so that we can be better at achieving our objectives in that contested domain?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Appreciate that. And, you know, we're in a much different time than we were the last time a service stood up. You know, 1946, 47, much different time. We had the numbers. The folks came back from World War II. They knew how to fight in the contested domain because they experienced it. They experienced that war fighting mentality. Now, and they had the resources, quite honestly. And then we stood up the service and they started to develop the resources necessary to build out the infrastructure to get to where we need to be. So that we can deliver combat capabilities in support of combatant commander requirements. I understand the Space Force is a much leaner, much agile force. How are you going to leverage, you can't leverage the same resources that the Air Force has leveraged to build out that infrastructure. And so I'm just curious, what are your thoughts on developing that infrastructure necessary to create the next generation space warfighter?
Yeah, well, first let me go back to the start there. Nothing is as clarifying as war, right? And the real onus that's put on senior leaders is we shouldn't have to learn our lessons by letting young Americans die in a war. And so what is it that we can learn from those previous experiences to make ourselves better before we get into that situation? I think we did learn those. We did learn those lessons coming out of World War II. We learned them again in Vietnam, and when I look at the weapons and tactics infrastructure, if you will, that I experienced at Nellis, it was a direct outgrowth of the people coming out of Vietnam that says, we're going to train differently. We're going to prepare our crews differently. And they built that infrastructure over many years, but they built that infrastructure to make themselves better so that that wouldn't happen again. And so we need to learn from that. And I think we have, at least the discussions that I'm in, people understand that advanced training and ranges and thinking adversaries in the form of professional aggressors, modeling and simulators that replicate the kinds of decisions that you would make in a contested environment. Those are all necessary things that we're going to have to pull together to give our operators that next level of training so that we don't have to learn lessons coming out of a war, that we'll be ready for the next war. We'll be ready for a high-end competition and have the right skills, the right equipment, and the right operational concepts moving forward.
Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And I suspect the infrastructure, we're not going to build a Nevada test and training range to be able to conduct that type of infrastructure to conduct space warfighting operations and training to provide that. So I suspect we're going to have to move towards a more virtualized environment, probably a data accurate environment so that we can conduct those training operations in a realistic training environment.
Well, I mean, it's a great point because one, we are going to be small, we're going to be lean, we're going to be agile, but we also got to be innovative. And so we're going to do things differently. And we have to take advantage of some of those gifts, right? I don't have to pull 8 Gs in the space weapon system to gain an effect over an adversary. Right. And so I don't need the range space for those purposes to train that physical piece of it. What we do in space operations anyway is via RF links. It's in the cognitive space where we create those advantages. And so, we can take advantage of that. We don't need the airspace. We don't need the same kind of live experiences so that our operators understand the environment, understand what the adversary can and can't do. And so it is a perfect setup for modeling and simulation. I hope eventually we also get to live capabilities, either on orbit or in some sort of mock-up range, because I'll tell you from experience that if you think you can close an RF link in the simulator the same way you close an RF link through weather or on a bad slant angle, or, there are actual physical properties associated with the space domain that we're going to also have to learn and make sure operators understand it. So it'll be a growth over time. But we need to take advantage of the fact that we can do good simulator work and get more out of this advanced training.
Great. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. You talked about being innovative and being agile, and a lot of press about being a very flat organization, the Space Force being a flat organization. Can you describe the efficiencies that have been created because of that organizational structure?
Well, it's still a work in progress, but here's the theory first,
Mm-hmm.
is we want to make the distance between the operator on console in the units and the senior operator in the Pentagon as tight as possible, as
Right.
tight as possible. Why is that? Because we make decisions up here in terms of resourcing and policy and guidance and force development and all of the things that are necessary to give the operators the skills they need. We make those decisions here, and we need to understand with direct feedback what matters to the people in the field. And so by compressing that as much as possible, we can tighten that feedback loop up. And so we've already taken steps to compress what used to be 5 Air Force layers, from MAGCOM to NAF to wing, group, squadron, into 3. We have our field commands, we have the deltas, and then you're at the squadron level. That in and of itself has compressed that down. The fact that we built the deltas, those are mission-focused deltas. They are singularly focused on mission. That should, again, tighten the feedback loop. We'll have the support side through a different structure. But right now, those Delta commanders with their squadrons, that should be a tight mission-focused feedback loop. And then we want that up fast. And so we're going to have to practice it because, again, you got to build these habits over time. And we don't want to fall back into those old habits. And so we'll, keep calling us on it because we want to go fast. We want to go very fast and tighten that feedback loop down.
Great. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. And big news this week, Lieutenant General Stephen Whiting promoted and accepted command of Space Operations Command. Could you explain the relationship between your office and how you're going to support Space Operations Command a little bit?
He has 2 very important responsibilities. He's the Service Component Commander to U.S. Space Command, which means he's the warfighter for U.S. Space Command with regards to Space Forces. So as the chief operator up here in the Pentagon, I have to watch what he's doing. I have to hear what his problems, what his challenges are, so that we can make sure that we are providing him everything he needs to be successful, and that whole team to be successful in that role. And he also has the organized, train, and equip responsibilities for all those deltas that are assigned under him. And so he has to think about their training, and he has to think about their readiness because they are right there in the fight. And one of the hard parts of what we do is that we operate from garrison. So at the same time that we do normal reconstitution and training activities, we simultaneously are conducting the combatant commander's mission. And so getting that balance with what we do there at the units is important. And we've got to work through those. The Space Mission Force was designed to start to kind of divide up those responsibilities a little bit. So there's time for advanced training and time for war fighting, and carve that out. We've had some successes, and I see progress as we move forward that, but I think there's still more work to be done there. I think we can take advantage of that construct a little better and maybe get a little more time for training, give them some better tools so that when they are doing the training, it's more effective.
Yes, sir. Thank you. You talk about making sure you have the voice of the operator. Could you explain some of the examples, the successful examples that you've demonstrated to ensure that you capture the tactical operator, the intelligence professional, the logistics requirements, the cyber professionals' voice in the Space Force?
We talked about WEPTAC. So we have our own Space Weapons and Tactics Conference. It's an opportunity for operators, again, who understand the details of how these systems work, to present them with the threat-based scenarios that they are likely to face or could face. And then they start to discuss what needs to change, what are the shortfalls. Senior leaders come to those WEPTAC debriefs, and they want to hear directly from those young operators, what are the most significant challenges, what's going to work, what's not going to work, where do we need to shift our resources, are there policy and guidance issues that need to be corrected. I think that's a tremendous feedback loop that we conduct through that WEPTAC process. Space flags. We put senior leaders out there to hear the results of Space Flag. It's a training opportunity for these crew members. And when they experience it firsthand in that environment, we want to hear their impressions coming out of it. Wow, I never thought it would be like that. Or we were really successful here and we really struggled there. That is incredibly valuable feedback all the way up the chain. And I promise I'm paying attention to those things. I read the reports or I try to attend in person because I want to see the look in their eyes, you know, when they come out of the simulator and get that debrief for the first time.
Yes, sir. And the other big, I think, put there is the doctrine.
Oh, yeah.
That came out of, you know, the professionals at the
Yeah.
Space Force basically asked to write this initial doctrine document.
You're right. It was not written by General Raymond. You know, that doctrine came from our youngest folks, some of our youngest, best and brightest. And they took their experiences. They took the things that they'd been talking about, the things that they'd experienced in exercises and training and real world operations. And they very concisely boiled it down to these are the things that matter. And I think it's a terrific example of where the young people have been major producers and innovators in this new service.
Great. Thank you, sir. Appreciate that. We've got a question here from the audience, and this is always a topic of discussion in terms of, you know, what are the resources that the Space Force is going to acquire from the other services, specifically in terms of manpower. What is the discussion going on, or can you enlighten the audience about the ongoing discussion on how and what resources are going to transition from the other services to support the Space Force?
Sure. You know, we're kind of concluding round one, and that's what comes over from the Air Force. And that was a little easier to pick because we were all space operators in the Air Force and we knew the systems that were designed to support and defend us and et cetera. And so that was kind of the easy group. Now there were some areas where we had to explore, like what is it that comes out of the intelligence community? What is it that comes out of engineering and cyber? What parts of those should be a part of the Space Force? And so I went through a very deliberate process just to select who comes over and when they come over and how big of a group it is that comes over to the Space Force just from the Air Force. And so now the next round is, okay, what about the other services? And what I'll tell you, and this is all still pre-decisional, no decisions have been made on this yet, so I don't have any big news about these units are coming over, but I will tell you that those decisions are made at the highest levels. And it's a very deliberative process. I've sat in on the sessions, and it's a very logical, it's principle-based. We evaluate pros and cons and second and third order effects. You know, units in services have tentacles across all of the other aspects of a service. They're not easily just separable. Like you just pluck this out and put it over here, no problem. It just doesn't quite work like that. And so we have to be very deliberate. But you know, I think it is fair to say that there will be capabilities that come over to the Space Force. Which ones they are, still in debate. But because the debate is occurring, I think it's going to happen.
Yes, sir. And you mentioned the Space Mission Force. So I remember the initial discussions on trying to set that up. Could you just provide a quick background on what the Space Mission Force is, and then what you think and how you think the Space Mission Force could continue to evolve in your current role?
Absolutely. Yeah, you know, it was born out of some frustrations, just watching operations and realizing that we knew we needed to do better training. We knew that the training was a little bit rudimentary. Can you fly the satellite? Can you run the checklists? Can you get the missile tracks out under the right timelines? Those were the basics. The question is, what happens when things went wrong? Or what happens when an adversary was interfering? Or what happens, you know, do they have the skills, the training, the experience, the repetitions to be really good at that aspect of it? And, you know, 10, 12 years ago, my answer was, I'm not sure. I'm not sure. But the problem was, well, how do I fix that? I mean, the guys who need the training are busy doing the combatant commander's mission. And so the idea with the Space Mission Force was simply to try to find a way to create enough time in the schedule, if you will, for them to conduct advanced training. It was as simple as that. And what we tried to do is offset what we felt like were some lower priorities. And those lower priorities were day staff functions. Were there things that were being done full-time by crew members on day staff that maybe could be done as part-time? And I'll just give you a real simple example. You know, in the flying community in squadrons, instructor pilot is a qualification. It's something you do, but it's not just a job you hold where you don't do anything else. Your duty title is still pilot. You just happen to be qualified as an instructor pilot or as an evaluator. we kind of got into a mentality where once you were an instructor, that's kind of all you did. And you kind of came off of crew and became an instructor. So the original concept, and I'm not saying the way it is now, or, you know, to be honest, I haven't really dug in to see which units are doing which parts of this, but, you know, the original idea was kind of trade some of those full-time day staff jobs for part-time jobs to create the space necessary to do the advanced training. You know, I think with better simulators, with better capability, so that we can really exploit that time, those decisions and prioritization changes between day staff jobs and advanced training are going to be easier to make, and we're going to get better at it. And so this will kind of go, you know, hand in glove with our ability to put advanced training equipment in the hands of our operators.
Great, thank you, sir. And in fact, we've got a question from a space operator. PT Sanders is asking the question, what is the most important or hardest part of establishing Space Force culture that most of us are not talking about?
Yeah, PT, there's a smart kid, so he's asking hard questions. No, I appreciate that question. Here's the way I'll say it. The hard part about creating a culture is that it's not a direct act. I don't think you don't create a culture. You take actions, and the actions you take result in the culture that you want, hopefully. And so the question is, what is the actions that we should be taking, the behaviors? How should we do our jobs that we know that we need to do, and then generate the culture that we want as a result, not as a direct action? I can't just order somebody to, all right, read this is your culture, implement. You know, it doesn't work like that. So that's the hard part, is figuring out what exactly are those activities which will drive the culture we want. And we got to make sure, because every action we take will drive a culture, right? It will drive a culture. The other hard part of this, I think it's the other side of the same coin, is don't for a minute think that we didn't come into the Space Force with a culture. Right. We're not just blank slates walking in and going, okay, what's the culture here now? You know, there's a culture, and the culture is from where we grew up in Space Command or in Stratcom, and, you know, all of the work we've done in the Air Force leading up to now. And we bring all that with us. Some of it, I think we want to keep and hang on to. There's some very positive aspects of that culture. We've talked about some. Mm-hmm. There might be other places where, because we want to focus on space and contesting space, maybe we need to shift that culture a little bit. And now as a new service, we have that opportunity. And so unlearning some of the old habits is pretty tough too. And so it's going to be, these aren't built in a day. Rome wasn't built in a day, but we'll get after it, PT.
Great. Thank you, sir. I appreciate your answer on that. Let's see. Thinking about, this is from Trey York, thinking about how to man the new squadron growth while staying within the 16,000 manning cap. Is that going to be an issue?
You know, I have no idea, because we are so early on in this process. The to-do list is so long, and there's so much to be done that are just foundational. The idea of expanding and growing and getting to that next level, it's probably a discussion that's going to be had. It's just not the one we're having right now. I have the people, or will get the people, have the billets that we need to do the stand-up work, to transition out of the Air Force into the Space Force, and then start to build our own processes and procedures. And so that's what we're focused on right now, is the stand-up. There'll come a day when some of the younger people that grow up behind me will have to face some of those challenges about resourcing and that sort of thing. But for now, I feel like I have what I need. I just got to organize it properly, or I got to point it in a different direction than they were pointing yesterday.
Great. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. Lieutenant Colonel Raj Agrawal, he's a fan of SFA and follows a lot of our webinars, and he can't get through a webinar without asking a question. So I really appreciate his leadership. Lieutenant Colonel Dr. Raj Agrawal is asking, by removing layers of leadership, is there a risk that senior leaders will be more involved in the tactical level versus giving tacticians more trust and freedom of maneuver?
Raj, report to my office immediately after this webinar. No, I'm just kidding. That's a great question. You know, it's, of course, you know, we always say it like that, like the worst thing that could possibly happen to operations is some 3-star like me down there meddling in the business. Absolutely. I do not know how to operate those systems, My involvement at the tactical level would do nothing but slow things down. So is there risk? Maybe, but maybe only for smarter people that feel like they can do that. What I want is that compressed, tight feedback loop. If I don't understand what's going on down there, I'll never be able to properly resource it. I'll never be able to provide the proper guidance. And so I think it's more about making sure I understand what my role is, where I add value, and then making sure that feedback loop is as tight as possible. I certainly don't want to be disconnected. And so maybe the better way to answer is I'll take a little bit of that risk, Raj, because I want that feedback loop tight.
Thank you, sir. Let's see. We got one from Scott Trinrud, who asks, as the COO and the broad set of responsibilities that go with that, how do you intend to implement the assessment process for a brand new service, VICE, assessing performance of weapon systems?
Right. Great question. And so let me catch everybody up to this. If you're not tracking, one of the things I'm trying to accomplish as the chief operating officer is taken a little bit from the corporate mentality that, you know, in the C-suite structure, what the COO is responsible for is evaluating whether or not and how well a company is meeting its goals. And so I've just taken that on. I've said, listen, the Space Force is trying to accomplish a few things. How well are we doing? You know, given the goals, given the objectives, how well are we doing? And it's not limited to just, is the GPS signal as accurate as it should be? It's not just what's the uptime for any particular radar. Those are also important, and those are things that we're going to measure. But it's, hey, are you getting enough joint experience so that you're more effective when you're assigned to the C-spot? Is the training curriculum sufficient to meet all of our advanced training goals? So there's force development aspects to this. There's system performance aspects, and then I think there's mission performance aspects. It's one thing to say the SATCOM is not being interfered with. It's another to say, are we reaching all the users? Are there bandwidth issues? Are we targets? And we need to find a way to be more resilient in a contested environment. So we'll have to evaluate the missions, the systems, and then the people and the processes we have. And we're going to try to tackle all that.
Sir, that's a big lift. And you've got no shortage of tasks, that's for sure. I got one from Space Rep out in NATO, Lieutenant Colonel Henry Herron. He is curious about how the U.S. Space Force is being established at a time when multi-domain ops, joint all-domain C2, seems to be pushing beyond, perhaps diminishing service tribes. What additional challenges is the Space Force facing in its infancy while domain growth propagation is reaching an all-time high?
Did Blue Heron just write a big run-on sentence that I got to try to figure out? Okay, no problem. Thanks, Blue. I appreciate that. You know, it's a really thoughtful question, and I've always tried to struggle, and not struggle, but it's important that we keep evaluating what's the role of the service versus what is the role of the joint community in taking what the service provides and then optimizing effects for combatant commanders. And I see this as one of those kind of balancing acts. Our responsibility as a service, advocate for resources, provide the guidance, structure, the training for those forces so they are ready to go into a joint environment and be a part of a joint team, effectively integrate, and get the job done faster than any adversary can respond. That last piece requires the joint all-domain C2. That's what really ties it together. And so we can build perfect forces, great troops, well-trained, and then they can go into a joint environment. And if they don't have a C2 structure, if they don't have the data networks and the links and nodes to actually come together and fight as a joint force, they're not going to be as successful as they could be. And so we have a service responsibility to provide it. And then it's that joint community, guys like Blue out there in UCOM, NATO, that have to tie that together. And so I still see this as a balance between two important responsibilities: organized, train, equip, and then the war fighting. And I see the JADC2 on that other side.
Great, thank you, sir. And thanks for answering that question. As a note, we're going to be conducting a space warfighter talk with Lieutenant Colonel Herron next week. So stay tuned for that. And so we can hear more about that discussion. Good question here, I think, definitely important. We as the U.S. never go it alone. So could you describe the relationship with and the criticality of our international partners in support of what the operations we conduct in the Space Force?
Yeah, absolutely. And let me just harken back to my firsthand experience in the desert, where we were, you know, that was the DCFAC, C for combined. and we had some unbelievable coalition partners. And those were partners in the air and space. We had space partners out there from our allies and partners. It is such a force multiplier. And honestly, I could go on and on. I'll give you a couple of examples. There are things that some countries can do policy-wise that we can't do. What a tremendous synergy when they come together, because there are things that we can do that they can't do. And that's both technically and policy-wise. And so, and then the broader issue is, if you're going to attack somebody that has a network of hardcore allies and partners, you are biting into a big elephant. Is that an analogy, metaphor? I mean, you realize if we cross this line, it's not just the U.S. that we're gonna be facing. It's this broad coalition. It's one of our real asymmetric advantages, is that when we go to fight, we go as a joint team and we go as a coalition team. And so anybody that's going to oppose us, anybody that's going to compete against us, they are facing that specter, and it's just a powerful thing. So we have to figure out, how do we data share? How do we provide, if one country is going to provide payloads that we can use, how do we provide them information and access that helps build a synergistic relationship? Norway is helping us in space. We're going to have other agreements in Japan. It's going to be, that coalition is going to be a powerful force in the world of great power competition.
Thank you, sir. Appreciate that, and completely agree. There's been a number of occasions where obviously deployed to Korea and Afghanistan, and visited Germany and the UK, and obviously our international partners are going to be critical in everything that you do as the Space Force. So
hey, Bill, can I add to that?
Yeah.
You know, one of the things I got the most value out of when I was over there as a DC FAC is I would have these one-on-one conversations with the senior leaders of the other nations. And every single time I had one of those meetings, they brought a perspective and I learned something, and I'm like, holy, I never thought of that. It just didn't even occur to me. Our American perceptions, our American mindset, you don't even know that you have those assumptions. And then somebody from a different country, especially with COVID outbreak occurring at the end of my time, it's like I never thought about that perspective. And so diversity of thought, inclusion of the coalition, there's a diversity and inclusion message in coalition operations. We want to make sure they're a part of the team, and we want to listen, because those perspectives are so valuable.
Great. Thank you, sir. I appreciate that. We got Colonel Retired Rich Birchfield, the Executive Director of Catalyst Campus for Technology and Innovation here in Colorado Springs. He's got the question that says, what do our space warfighters need from local communities and industry to support and be better, stronger teammates to the Space Force?
Undying love and support, Rich. Undying love and support. Like any military environment, the community makes it. I want everybody in the Department of Defense to want to be assigned to one of our space bases. If there's Space Force on that base, that's where you want to be. Why? Because we have great partnerships, whether it's industry, whether it's with the school system, whether it's with the community leaders, because that makes it a positive experience, and people work better in positive environments. And so it's going to take work. We're going to have to reach out. We're going to have to talk and explain and educate. But we've been doing that for years as in the space community. And I think that's one of those hallmarks of where we operate, is that it's a great community, and people want to be there and do that work. In fact, it's really hard to get people out of Colorado sometimes. I'm in the Pentagon. I got to get somebody to come replace me. So we got to build that community here, I guess. So. Yes, sir.
No, that's valid. Appreciate that. Sir, as we close, because I know you've got so much going on and you're very busy, I suspect it's 20-hour days, 6 days a week. Perhaps you get a day off. I'm not sure. But I really appreciate you taking an hour out of your day. What can the Space Force Association do to continue to support the Space Force? How can we help you out?
I think just keep having these discussions, Bill. I mean, we want to be lean, agile, and innovative. So let me focus on innovation. Good ideas don't just come from us. The people sitting up here in the Pentagon, in fact, very few of them come from us. And it's these discussions. It's these people writing in with questions. It's the articles that are written that we read. keep generating the discussion, keep generating the right kinds of discussions, keep talking about a contested environment, keep talking about resourcing, keep talking about coalition, keep talking about diversity and inclusion. All of those key things that make us successful, keep the dialogue going. The more ideas we generate, the more we talk in public about these things. That's how innovation, it sparks a thought and then somebody takes an action. It's an incredibly powerful force multiplier just to keep that conversation going. So thanks for doing it now, and keep that part going, and I think it'll pay dividends for us.
Great, thank you, sir. And you bring up a good point. And I just want to let the audience know, and folks listening in, we have established the Space Force Journal, and we expect to get the first publication to print by the 20th of December on the first anniversary of the stand-up of the Space Force. And the call for papers has gone out. So if you're interested and want to capture some of these discussions and write a paper on it, as General Saltzman's been talking about for the last 45 minutes, please reach out and let us know, and we'll get you the information to submit a paper. So thank you for that, sir. And we will continue to do that. Any closing remarks from your position there in the Pentagon and Space Force leadership?
Well, I would just say to everybody that's listening, you know, thanks. We have done so much over this last year. It's not quite a year yet, about 10 months, closing in on that first birthday. It's amazing what's been accomplished. With a small and mighty force. We have stood up organizations, the largest reorganization in national security space in history. We've published Doctrine, like you said. You know, what an amazing set of accomplishments. And so to everybody listening, be proud. Be proud of that. Be proud. However you're contributing to the Space Force, be proud about it. There's plenty of work to do. But we should really take this next couple of months to really just sit back and think of where we've come from. We have a service dedicated to the space domain. And everybody out there has had some role in that along the way. And so thanks, take stock. We've really accomplished a lot, and then get ready for next year because there's lots more to come.
Great. Thank you, sir, for your time. It's always great catching up with you. I look forward to catching up with you in the future as this conversation continues to progress. But General Saltzman, on behalf of the entire Space Force Association, thank you so much for your time today, and have a great Space Force Day. Semper Supra.
Semper Supra. Thanks, Bill.
Bye now.